thanks to Matthew Lee in New York, who gave us a couple of questions in advance of the briefing. Sorry not to see you, Matthew. You've been on WebEx the last couple of times. But let me take a few of your questions. Matthew had one on Kenya, saying the Finance Ministry says it's discussing a $2.3 billion lending program with the IMF, including an initial disbursement of $725 million in the first half of 2021. What's the status of your talks? What's the IMF's view of the standard gauge railway project from Mombasa to Nairobi, which has a budget of Kenya shillings 327 billion, which some say indicates that the budget for this project was padded, says Matthew. In response to Matthew, I'd like to say, well, I can say a virtual staff mission to Kenya, to Nairobi, was held in November and discussed with the authorities an extended credit facility, extended fund facility program to support the next phase of Kenya's response to COVID-19. The program would provide resources to protect vulnerable groups and would reduce debt vulnerabilities over time through a multi-year fiscal consolidation centered on raising tax revenues. It would also advance the structural reform and governance agenda and address weaknesses in some state-owned enterprises that have been exacerbated by the COVID shock. And finally, it would strengthen the monetary policy framework and support financial stability. So that was the purpose of the discussions. I can tell you the mission, the IMF staff team, the mission, reached agreement in many areas. Discussions on remaining areas will continue in the coming period with a view to reaching agreement on a program that could be presented to our board, we think, in early 2021. So just responding to Matthew's question on that. I don't have an idea at this time, specific idea, on the size or the phasing of that potential borrowing arrangement, but clearly that will come into view as we head to the board, we think, in early 2021. And on the railway project, Matthew, I would refer you to our October 2018 staff report for Kenya's Article 4 consultation, which covered this standard gauge railway project in some detail, and I don't have anything further to that level of detail that we provided right now. I'm seeing some questions come in, and I'll turn to them, but let me take one more from Matthew, since he did come in advance. His other question was on Mozambique, and Matthew's asking, what's the impact on the IMF's approach of the decision by the EU on 100 million euros in direct support to the state budget of Mozambique, with monitoring and transparency clauses? Does the IMF include similar clauses in Mozambique and elsewhere? I'd like to say a couple of things on that. It's an important question. Number one, we welcome the EU's generous support to Mozambique to help with their COVID response. That support covers an important part of the government's financing needs, especially in the health sector, on the social safety nets, and more broadly. We share the EU's views on the importance of monitoring and transparency in the use of public funds. So more broadly, and again, thanks to Matthew for asking this question, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've talked about this before here, the IMF maintains its commitment to address governance and corruption vulnerabilities in member countries. IMF emergency financing is provided in upfront, outright disbursements without traditional IMF conditionality. We've talked about this before, a number of times before here. However, while there is less scope for attaching traditional conditions, the IMF is working on measures to promote transparency and accountability and to mitigate any opportunity for corruption, and obviously to ensure resources are used for their intended purposes. So just a few examples. We do ask authorities to commit in their letters of intent to us regarding the financing to enhanced reporting, to independent audits of emergency spending, to publication of procurement arrangements, and again, to ensure that these resources are used for their intended purposes, which is to help the people in these countries to fight the pandemic. It's really to ensure that resources can get to doctors and nurses and hospitals in this pandemic. Now, turning back to Mozambique, the $309 million assistance that we approved in April, again, include these types of measures on reporting and audit of the COVID-19 response spending, again, publishing procurement, monthly updates, etc. More broadly, the fund has long supported, this speaks to before the crisis, the pandemic. We've long supported the Mozambican authorities' efforts to address transparency, governance, and corruption issues, including through capacity development support in this area. And we support the government's reform priorities identified in their diagnostic report on transparency, governance, and corruption that was published in the summer of 2019 and prepared with IMF support. We've talked about that diagnostic report before here, so I won't go into the detail of that, but just to say we strongly support that